Get the cream, precious metals or the crypto things. Your bars are light like the one that's on the Smith machine. But my Maxwell and I ain't speaking about the pretty wings. Watch a potty.
People asked me to do a review of the Smashing Machine when I actually saw it, so here it is. The Rock stars in an A24/7 Bucks production of Mark Kerr's Smashing Machines. This is about Mark Kerr, an MMA fighter, a guy with a whole lot of potential, whose potential is cut short due to addiction and a toxic relationship with his wife, Dawn. The movie is basically what the documentary was. It shows pretty much the rise and fall of Mark Kerr's career. It features The Rock, who is bigger than Mark Kerr ever was. Not only is he taller than Mark Kerr, he's seemingly, well, he's about as wide as he was. The Rock looks extremely weird with that hairpiece, the sloped forehead as well, the Cro-Magnon forehead. It looked very weird. I give The Rock credit. He didn't do a bad job as the soft-spoken Mark Kerr, who was a very soft-spoken guy. He's also a very kind man. Even when he was on drugs, he was kind of nitpicky. And they showed that through the movie that he was kind of picking some arguments with Dawn. She was trying to be very sweet to him. And he was, bugging her about the cactus or about how much banana she puts in the smoothie. Even pouring it out at one point when she was trying to be nice. And the movie had that ebb and flow where Mark Kerr was being very bitchy to Dawn early in the movie. And then he got clean and she became a mess. So then she starts arguing with him about, whether she can go to California and train with him or not. And him trying to avoid the confrontation. And then she became the reason he got back to drinking and all this sort of stuff. So it was very much about Mark Kerr's struggle with addiction and how he's a huge could have been. You talk about Mark Kerr, you talking about a guy who won his very first Valley Tudo tournament. It was a one-night heavyweight tournament. He was gouging guys' eyeballs out and headbutting them and just kicking their ass. He fought in UFC in 1997. I think that was UFC 14. I think he fought before 97 as well. I'm not sure. They focused a bit on his fight with Igor Vovchanchin that he lost, where he lost it, but technically it was a no contest. He got kneed in the head. And you see how that loss or that defeat really shook his confidence. And this is where I kind of had a problem with some of the performances, because The Rock's fake crying during, the follow-up of losing that fight to Vovchanchin. And when he was overdosed, he was going, he just cover his face and go, no, you don't see any real tears. He just kind of covers his face and I'm like, come on, man, you can't do better than that. Of course, they highlighted how Mark Kerr had difficulties with the Japanese and them not wanting to pay him, which I heard was a continuing issue over in Pride. But overall, it told the same story that the Smashing Machine documentary did. That Mark Kerr was being trained by Mark Coleman. Mark Coleman in this movie was being played by Ryan Bader. And Mark Kerr ends up being overshadowed by Mark Coleman. And the movie ends, spoilers, with Mark Coleman winning the big Pride tournament in 2000. It seems to me like they want to try to make a movie that's kind of like Rocky. But Mark Kerr was not as a nice guy as he is. The movie didn't take the time to really establish who Mark Kerr was. Mark Kerr's entire story is that he was always a guy who was very good, but never reached his full potential. That's the real Mark Kerr story. Now, that's the story they were trying to tell in the Smashing Machine, but they could have done is actually show some of his NCAA stuff as well, because he defeated Randy Couture in the NCAA, and he was a chief rival of Kurt Angle's when Kurt Angle was wrestling amateur. And ironically, Mark Kerr dreamed of being the WWF champion one day. He wanted to be a pro wrestler, and he ended up doing Vale Tudo when he didn't make the Olympic team. Or I think he was an alternate or something on the Olympic team. I don't remember. But he was there when Kurt Angle won. And he talked about in interviews that he used to wipe the floor with this guy, and now he's an Olympic gold medalist, and I'm nothing or whatever. And it was similar with Mark Coleman, because Mark Coleman was not really considered a big deal, and he was just a trainer for Mark Kerr. And then Mark Coleman goes on to have a Hall of Fame career, and Mark Coleman became a UFC Hall of Famer. And I know Mark Kerr is now, but it took a while. It took longer than it probably should have. And I think a lot of the attention of the documentary and the movie led to Mark Kerr's Hall of Fame induction, because his story is one of a guy who never reached his full potential. And the movie kind of gets you there, kind of. But I think they should have really drove that home, that Mark Kerr has all this potential and he just keeps falling short. He's in his own way. You know, it's performance enhancing drugs, it's painkillers, it's Dawn, it's one thing after another, it's alcohol, it's all these problems. But it seemed to me like I don't know if we needed this movie, you know? And I think that's pretty much what it boils down to, is that I'm not sure we needed a Smashing Machine movie. I'm not sure we needed this. This feels like something that was an amalgamation of the bosses over at TKO wanting to put The Rock in something that furthered UFC, kind of their way of mixing UFC and WWE, and a way of freshening up The Rock's persona in Hollywood. So he's not just the action guy, but he's also capable of doing dramas. And I don't think The Rock did bad. And I don't think the movie was bad. But I think the documentary was so much better because it was so much more real. And watching The Rock look like one of the cavemen from the Geico commercials with this sloped forehead and this really bad hairpiece. And the fact that some of the dialogue is cribbed directly from the documentary. Like, some of the dialogue is cribbed directly from the documentary. To me, it felt like they didn't put enough elements in it to make it creative. You know, it seemed like they tried to do almost a dramatized version of the documentary. The thing is, we got the documentary, you know, and the movie should have brought something that we didn't have before. New information that we didn't have before, or told the story a little bit differently than we had seen it before. But as a dramatized version of the documentary, well, buddy, we already got the documentary, you know? We already got this story. And again, like I said, some of the language is cribbed one-to-one from the documentary. Some of the scenes are even cribbed one-to-one from the documentary. So they didn't have a problem with historical inaccuracy. It just had a problem with redundancy. If you've already seen the documentary and you're already familiar with the story of Mark Kerr, you didn't learn anything from this movie that you didn't already know. You just saw The Rock acting like Mark Kerr, and it was okay. It wasn't the worst, and I'm very glad that Mark Kerr enjoyed it. I'm glad Kurt Angle enjoyed it. I'm glad that a lot of people who watched the movie enjoyed it. I'm glad Bas Rutten got paid to be in it. That rules. Whenever Bas Rutten can get a paycheck, I like that. But overall, man, I just didn't see the necessity of the movie's existence. The movie didn't justify its own existence as far as I'm concerned. We've seen all this stuff already in the documentary that's over 20 years old. So it felt to me like it was more of a project of The Rock trying to cut corners and get into dramatic Hollywood films rather than The Rock trying to tell an earnest story of redemption or an earnest story of how a guy could get in his own way with drugs and alcohol in his toxic relationship. So let's do the David Mamet questions, which are questions that when I do a movie review, I always look at these questions. 1, what does your hero want? 2, who or what stands in their way? 3, what happens if they don't get it? And 4, why now? Now, 1, what does your hero want? So Mark Kerr is clearly the hero of the story. Mark Kerr wants to be, of course, a superstar MMA fighter. He lives most of that dream. He makes a ton of money in mixed martial arts, working in Japan mostly. And that's what he wants, and he kind of achieves that. But what stands in his way is what the movie is mostly about. You see the guy throwing headbutts, so he's causing all kind of head damage to himself. He's getting kneed in the head by Igor Vovchanchin. He's taking drugs, PEDs. He's also addicted to painkillers. He's also addicted to Dawn, who is an alcoholic, and she's causing all kinds of trouble. So all of these things are in his way as he's trying to continue his career. And he overdoses on drugs. So all of these things are in his way. 3 is what happens if he doesn't get it. If he falls short of his potential, then likely he becomes, a huge could have been in mixed martial arts. And that's exactly what happens, is because of all of these distractions and his lack of discipline in terms of drugs and alcohol and not cutting Dawn loose sooner, he does become a huge could have been in mixed martial arts, where people really love the documentary because it's such a human story. But almost nobody remembers Mark Kerr's career because it was such and such in the early days of UFC when they were having fights in Alabama. And most of his stuff was in Pride, and Pride has gone out of business, 15 years, almost 20 years. Pride has been out of business. And why now? Why is the story happening now? Well, they didn't justify the why now. The why now should have been because Mark Kerr's amateur wrestling career is over. And so now he's going into mixed martial arts. They probably said that, in the documentary, in the movie, but it was never really justified about why all of the events of the movie is happening right now. But the movie picks up right at his very first Vale Tudo fight. So it's after his amateur wrestling career. And he's portrayed a lot by The Rock as The Rock goes on his PR junket, as Mark Kerr is this pioneer of mixed martial arts. I don't know. I think you have to be a little bit older to be a pioneer. I think he's one of the guys that helped popularize it. And maybe that counts as being a pioneer, but the movie didn't really justify why now. It didn't really put it, why are these movies, events happening right now? Because when we meet Mark Kerr, he's already addicted to PEDs and painkillers and all this stuff. We didn't see him go from being a guy who was clean to start doing that stuff. He starts the movie doing steroids and painkillers and stuff. So, and that's part of the real story. His real life is he started doing steroids and things like that before he even had his very first Vale Tudo fight. So I don't think they really justified the why now, but it was fine overall. Again, I think the movie's a solid 6.5, 6.9. I wouldn't say it was a 7. I really thought The Rock looked ridiculous. I really do. But I think Mark Kerr is a big guy, but he's very soft-spoken. He's a very kind-hearted guy. And I think The Rock kind of did a good job of showing how kind-natured Mark Curry could be. Even when he's being a dick, he wasn't being, a raving lunatic. He was kind of just nitpicking Dawn and stuff like that and causing issues, causing friction when there shouldn't be any. And I thought, like, okay, they did a good job of not brutalizing Mark Curry here, but also just kind of telling the story of the documentary. So if you like sports movies, you might like this. For me, it was okay, but it wasn't all that. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
MagMongoSlade. Best house I ever drew, Daddy.